Welcome to Leading People with me, Jerry Murray. This episode of Leading People is brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's WIDECIRCLE.eu. Leading People is a podcast which features insightful conversations with leading people about leading people. Yes, that's a play on words. In each episode, you get tips from leading people such as CEOs, HR professionals, authors, and thought leaders on all aspects of leading people, including how to attract, engage, develop, and grow talent to build successful organizations. And we provide insights on how to lead yourself so you can consistently perform at your best. This week I sat down with leading author and consultant Craig Weber to chat about conversational capacity and 3 critical practices that help you develop this. Craig highlights many essential skills and provides practical tips that individuals and teams can apply immediately to get better at those tough conversations that life throws at us from time to time. Craig Weber, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Craig, it's great you're coming in from the west coast of the United States, I believe, at the moment. Isn't that right? And I'm sitting.
That's right.
Sitting just outside Brussels. So the wonders of modern technology yet again. I've read your great books, and I'm really pleased that you've come on the show. So maybe for our listeners who haven't yet had the experience of your work, maybe some of them haven't heard about you. Maybe we could just start with, how did you get here? Was there a person, place, or an event, or something on your journey, or an epiphany moment that sort of brought you to the stage where you decided to write not just 1 but 2 books on the first book, of course, on conversational capacity? Let's maybe just start with a little bit about yourself and how you got here.
Okay, happy to. Yeah, my formal education is in organizational development and organizational psychology, and that's how I kind of got interested in the core research my work builds on. But I think if you dial it all the way back to the beginning, kind of a pivotal experience, I never thought of this for years, but then in writing my second book, I actually include this in the preface to the book, I realized that at a very early age, as a young kid, I was actually afraid. Genuinely scared, terrified of 2 things: going to war and going to work. And on the one hand, going to war, I used to watch Vietnam on the War as a kid, see the news footage and think, wow, when I turn 18, I have to do that. That was terrifying, right? That didn't seem very pleasant. But then at the same time, I'd listen to my dad come home from work and talk about all the nonsense there. I watched my grandfather, just before retirement, get laid off by a long-term employer. And to me, the idea of having to go to work every single day and do something you don't really enjoy with people you don't really get along with, just to make a living, seemed like a miserable way to spend time. So I think in many ways, that was the genesis for some of this work. That deep-seated fear of work and what a horrible, rotten, terrible experience it seemed to be from everything I was seeing as a kid.
So out of that genesis, you went looking for a remedy, I guess.
Not consciously. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was actually a terrible, terrible, terrible high school student, and it wasn't very disciplined or focused. And so it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do. I kind of bounced around for a bit. But when I first caught wind of the idea that there's a field out there that when I first heard about it, it was called corporate education. This idea that you could be a teacher of sorts, but in a corporate environment, that really connected with me. And then went off to school and started studying organizational development and began to fall in love with the research of Chris Argyris at Harvard and Don Schoen at MIT and their work around organizational learning and dialogue. And that really clicked for me. And so that was kind of how we got into this work, if you will.
Okay. And then I guess, like a lot of people in our field, we have this ambition at some stage we're going to write that book, and we're I have this ambition myself. I'm hoping to realize it one of these days. But the book eventually, I guess, it emerges. So give us some background to why did you decide to write the first book, Conversational Capacity? Was there something that you'd noticed in your work that said, it's just crying out for this book, or how did that book come about?
Yeah, I've always been a voracious reader, so I've been a consumer of books my entire life. Always loved to read. My mom instilled that in me at a very early age. So, I think I like the idea of writing a book. I like writing. Secondly, I think the ideas are getting such attraction. They were getting such positive response in my clients that I thought, how do I get these ideas out to a broader audience? And a book seemed like a natural strategy. So the combination of, liking to write as a craft, and then second, the ideas being something I think are powerful, are needed. And I think the book fills a gap in a lot of the work out there being done around leadership development, organizational development, management development. That, how do you get out there and, as Herbie Hancock said, put a ding in the universe. Well, I think it was Steve Jobs said that. He said, "I want to throw a rock in the pond of ideas and make a ripple." That was Herbie Hancock. I like that idea. So that was kind of the idea. I want to throw a rock out there in the pool of ideas and make a ripple.
Great. And we will get to the second book as we go through the conversation, because that bit, I think, built on the first one. But for those sitting out there saying, okay, what is this concept of conversational capacity? How would you explain that to them? What is it anyway?
Yeah, that's a good question. I get asked that a lot, actually. If I'm sitting on a plane, for example, and someone finds out I wrote a book called Conversational Capacity, that's inevitably the next question. What's conversational capacity? And I can define it in more than one way. And I'll give you two quick ways. One is what I call, the dictionary definition. It's usually my elevator speech. And I would say conversational capacity refers to the ability, and this can be of an individual or an entire team of people, but it's the ability to have constructive, learning-focused dialogue about difficult subjects in challenging circumstances and across tough boundaries. And so, as I'll often tell management teams, the more difficult the issues you're facing, the more challenging the problems you're trying to solve, the more aggressive the strategy you've set for yourselves, and the more stringent the differences of things like personality, opinion, or even cultural background around the table, the more important a variable this becomes in a team's performance. So high conversational capacity, a team can put its most difficult, painful, divisive issue on the table in a meeting and do really good work around it. Whereas low conversational capacity and a minor difference of opinion will screw up a meeting. So in that sense, sort of a foundational competence, but not something that tends to be on our management dashboard, not something we're paying nearly as much attention to as I think we should, given its pivotal impact on almost every activity that depends on people communicating and collaborating effectively for its effectiveness.
Yeah, and I had this vision of you on the plane when you mentioned conversational capacity, and basically not being able to stop talking for about 4 hours, because the person wanted to test it. But apart from that, one of the things
that's happened.
Probably has happened. They say, "Come on, man, let's see how much capacity you have."
Yeah, I've actually got work out of that, actually. Sit next to someone on the plane, strike up a conversation, talk about what I do, exchange cards, and then, actually get a new client. So,
fantastic.
That's right. You get a meal, you get a drink, and you get a new client on your flight. That's not a bad way to travel.
No. And one of the things I remember in the book was, and I think this might be something that would intrigue our readers, is that it's not always the dysfunctional teams that need conversational capacity. You mentioned these examples of teams where everything seems to be all rosy in the garden, and just talk to us a little bit about that, because that's quite revealing, isn't it? Many people might be sitting out saying, "Oh, this conversational capacity, sure, we're great. We get together and talk all the time,
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I start off with an example of an early client of mine in Silicon Valley that, they were thriving. This company was doing really well, like a rocket ship taking off, extremely successful. And they brought in a new CEO who asked me to kind of interview the executive team to say, "I want to know what I've inherited here." And so I did interviews with the executive team, and virtually everyone I interviewed said, "This is the best team I've ever been on in Silicon Valley. This is fantastic, smart, sharp, people get along really well, not a lot of personality conflicts, best team I've ever been on." And their marketing person, who was by far the most outspoken character on the team, said, "This is the best team I've ever been on in Silicon Valley for a simple reason. There isn't a single jerk on it." Jerk is not the word he used. Not a single jerk on it. He said, here's the problem. There are all sorts of really pressing issues we need to be discussing because of the growth we're experiencing and an IPO we're gearing up for. And no one's willing to put these tough issues on the table and address them directly because no one wants to become the team's first jerk. And so it was nice. It was agreeable. They got on well. There was not a lot of dysfunction per se in an explicit way. But there were a lot of issues they really needed to be talking about. They weren't able to talk about because there was this trade-off between maintain this nice, agreeable, friendly culture and address really hard, pragmatic issues that are going to force us to kind of test those relationships a little bit. And so it's a good example of where conversational capacity is low because in some ways you could say nice is getting in the way of effective.
Right.
Is that the example you were thinking of there?
Yeah,
Jerry?
that's exactly the one. And in my own experience, it's the sort of like the elephants are actually, they're not quite dancing. They're sort of walking around the table and everybody's just feeding them. I'm just thinking, well, just keep them calm here. And yet not addressing those so-called elephants who are just eager to dance can often be putting off that moment until the real SH1T hits the fan, right? And then you got some serious issues to deal with, right?
That's right. Then when the stuff hits the fan, then suddenly these issues we've avoided rise to the surface, and often we're ill-equipped to deal with them. The muscles needed, so you could say, to engage in those conversations are so atrophied from lack of use. When those conversations are forced on us, then things get really dysfunctional. And so it's like, it's like pay now or pay later. And a lot of times we kind of keep holding off. We don't make any installments on the conversation. And then when it's forced on us, things go south in a big way because we're just in over our heads. In fact, that's another way of thinking about conversational capacity. I'll often do a thought exercise with a team and say, imagine you've looked forward over the next year or so at your strategy, where you're going as a business. And out of that conversation, you've itemized the top 10 most important things you're going to face as a business, right? Challenges, decisions, conflicts, whatever it might be. They're all important, or you wouldn't have included them in the list. But imagine now you've ranked those issues in terms of how difficult they're going to be for your team. And at the bottom of the list is something that's important, but not that difficult. Up at the top is something that's important and extremely difficult. And every team, whether they know it or not, has a list like this. And in every team's list, there exists someplace a line. And that line in the list represents the conversational capacity of the team, its ability to engage in these issues in a constructive, learning-focused way. And when below the line, where the conversational capacity is sufficient, your team can do great work. Again, it doesn't mean there aren't strongly differing points of view, personalities that will not line up. It means despite all the messy variables that exist in the team, they've got the wherewithal to stay in a balanced place. It's above the line where things get dysfunctional. And how do you know what's above the line? Two things. One is, like you said, the elephants. Undiscussable issues, things we're not talking about, and we should. You're going to bring that up in the meeting, Jerry? Yeah, I'm not going to do it either. Almost every team has those issues that are, no one wants to put them on the table. Or as I often say, your listeners have probably all been in a meeting at some point in their life where, if you think about it, hands down, the most useful part of the meeting was the break. People are talking in the hallway, they're talking by the coffee machine in hushed tones. The other is the unproductively discussable issues, where there's heated arguments, butting heads. People aren't listening to each other. They're shutting one another down and dismissing views. And so that's how you know when the conversational capacity in a team is too low. Those two symptoms begin to crop up. And sometimes, people aren't talking about things they should, which may, as you pointed out, create the illusion, oh yeah, there's no dysfunction here. Oh no, we get along great. Or it may be the other, heated, headbutting and arguing, and you get, political nonsense, Machiavellian game playing going on. Those are the things you want to watch for that would signal conversational capacity could use a little work here.
Yeah, and in the second conversation, you're out in the hall and you're wondering what it was all about because you've had this heated discussion, isn't that right? And the other thing one of the things in the book that I quite enjoyed in both your books is you have a few diagrams or a few models in there, and they're just absolutely fantastic. That one you're describing now. And it sort of plays to this idea. The other thing that really stood out for me, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is that this is not sort of a nice to have thing. This is really foundational. If you look at dysfunctionality in organizations, in teams, and even just in our private relationships, the inability to have a conversation, I always say a conversation can solve so many problems if you know how to have them in the proper way. It seems to me that, for our listeners out there, this is not just about a nice thing that Craig has come up with. This is something that's foundational to every team and how that team starts off and how that team evolves.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because you think about it, almost every organizational activity depends on some form of communication for it to work effectively. Running meetings, making decisions, managing change, giving feedback, dealing with difficult customers, process improvement. So you name it, almost every core activity requires healthy, balanced, constructive dialogue. And if the team has the inability, it doesn't have the ability, let's say, to engage in constructive dialogue when and where it matters, every other activity is in trouble. It's hard to run a good meeting if the conversational capacity is low. It's hard to give constructive feedback if conversational capacity is too low. It's hard to deal with a really difficult, feisty, upset customer if conversational capacity is too low. So you're right. I think it's a foundational competence, but we don't often pay as much attention to it as we should. And I think partly because we lack good, rigorous constructs for making sense of it. If we're dealing with a financial problem or an engineering problem, we've got all sorts of tools available and frameworks available to make sense of it. But when it comes to how we communicate and engage with each other, I think a lot of the advice out there is a little less rigorous.
Yeah, it strikes me that an awful lot of this stuff doesn't get taught in schools.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. My brother Randy, talk about him in conversational capacity. He's a 6th grade school teacher here in Los Angeles, and he's actually been baking a lot of the conversational capacity work into his 6th grade curriculum. And so he's actually helping 6th graders, kind of cultivate their conversational capacity at a very early age. And they're at a critical stage where they're about ready to go into junior high school and high school where, social pressures, it's a very confusing time in life. And I'll be honest, I wish I'd have had access to some of the basic ideas we're talking about at that early an age. I think what an advantage that would give. And so we're actually started outlining a book, Conversational Capacity, in the classroom, helping teachers kind of embed some of these core concepts in their curriculum to help students learn to navigate these tough, complex social situations in a more healthy, balanced way. So it's pretty amazing, too, the stories about how quickly the kids take to this. I think there's less defensiveness, less ego. They're eager to learn, and so they tend to dive into this with both feet. And I've been really, really impressed with how far he gets with these kids.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember you talking about that in the book, and I think it's in many ways, like so many things, it's a very valuable thing to introduce into schools. So that people can go into the workplace a bit better equipped than they do, because we get an awful lot of emphasis on technical and knowledge skills, and knowledge in general, and yet a lot of the time people get tripped up because of these slightly what they're perceived to be softer skills, but they're not really so soft at the end of the day, are they?
Yeah, a lot of times those soft skills actually produce all the hard problems, right? So I think that's right. And we're looking at the educational system. I mean, teachers, educators, they have a really hard time, right? I mean, it's not an easy job at all. And so how do they kind of embed this in their, curriculum so that kids are maybe learning some of the basics? How do they also perhaps use these skills with each other? So faculty meetings, let's say. There's going to be a lot of conflict, a lot of tension on the faculty. And then lastly, when they're dealing with parents, I give the example in the book of the parent-teacher conference that's handled in an extremely deft way, because at least one person in the room knows these skills and is able to shape the conversations in a more purposeful direction, despite the fact that other people in the room don't know these skills and are quite upset, actually. So, yeah, I think that's great. I agree. I think the educational space is an interesting place to look.
In this next part of our conversation, we dive into the nuts and bolts of conversational capacity and influence in action. So I'd like to go into the nuts and bolts now, and I'd like to arrive at the sweet spot, but I'd like to first maybe introduce what the framework in your second book, because the sweet spot would be let's say in the third step, and maybe we can get there through the three constructs, and then when you get to that third one, you can start to elaborate, because it's actually incredibly how ingenious the way you've just formulated it. I think most people can get their heads around it, so I'll let you just talk about it now.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you. And We could define conversational capacity in a third way, and it's the ability to maintain balance between two critical things in a conversation. And if you're in a room full of people, let's say with high conversational capacity, one thing you'd notice is abundant is candor. The conversations are very honest, they're open, they're forthright, it's direct, there's not a lot of artifice. People are talking in very clear, candid ways, right? So I'm not wondering what Jerry thinks about the issue we're discussing because the candor is extremely high. But unhinged candor is not always a good thing. And so in the sweet spot, it's balanced with lots of curiosity. If you and I are talking and suddenly we realize we disagree on a subject we both care about, rather than get defensive and shut down or get defensive and argue, we get curious and lean in. Wow, we don't see this the same way. That's interesting. Let's dig in a little bit. And I think that's the balance we want to learn to maintain both as individuals and in teams, is this balance between candor and curiosity. But what tends to happen under pressure is people and teams begin to trigger out of the sweet spot. Some people start to trigger and they drop candor and become overly guarded and cautious, right? They're feigning agreement. Other people trigger out of the sweet spot the other direction, let go of curiosity, and become arrogant and argumentative. And so to your point, the question becomes, okay, if maintaining this balanced state in a tough conversation or meeting is critical, how do we cultivate the ability? How do we build our conversational capacity at the individual and the collective level? And so there's 3 domains of practice, and we can talk about each of those and kind of go back and forth on them. There's an awareness piece, there's a mindset piece, and there's a skill set. And so if you think about it, there's 3 components of practice. There's an emotional part of the practice, there's a cognitive part of the practice, and there's a behavioral part of the practice. And so the emotional piece is the awareness. We need to be conscious of the emotional reactions that tend to throw us and others off balance in difficult, high-pressure moments, not so we can not be triggered, but so we can learn to act more intentionally despite the trigger. That's where the heavy lifting comes in.
Yeah, and I'm hearing this you're one of several guests, and this self-awareness is a common denominator across the entire spectrum, no matter what it is, the skill set that you're trying to embrace. How do people get that self-awareness? What are some of the tips you can give them?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways, and it depends on what you're looking to, what kind of self-awareness, right? So that's the Greeks, they've been talking about this since ancient Greece, right? The unexamined life is unworth living, right? So I think this notion that self-awareness is really critical to a well-lived life is an ancient idea, and it's not easy to get right. And so it depends on what you're trying to become aware of. Tasha Eurich wrote a great book. She wrote it. It is, where she got it? Insight. Great book on self-awareness, looking at, being conscious of how you land on other people, so to speak. So, self-aware people are more aware of how they're impacting others around them. So it's not just about navel-gazing, becoming conscious of all your, internal programming. It's being aware of the situation you're in and how you're affecting it. But in my work, the awareness we try to cultivate is very specific. And again, there's these 2 emotional reactions that throw us out of the sweet spot in surprising and often disturbing ways. And the reason these emotional reactions are so problematic is they're not minor tendencies. They're grounded in the fight-flight response, right? So these are very strong and very base emotional, signals that in a threatening situation, whether it's a physical threat or a social threat, they can trigger us out of the sweet spot in surprising and disturbing ways. One of these things triggers, we drop candor. The other triggers, we drop curiosity. And so what I really work with people to accomplish is how do you become more conscious of the situations, the issues that tend to trigger you one way or the other. And a very simple practice I help people adopt is to start keeping a trigger journal. And so when I work with a client, they tend to keep a trigger journal. I keep a Word document on my desktop. And when I trigger out of the sweet spot, I ask myself 3 simple questions. What was the trigger? What was it that set me off? Was I feeling treated unfairly? Was I being disrespected? Did someone disagree with me publicly? There's a range of different triggers out there. And then how did I let it affect my behavior is the second question. So, I used to say, how did it affect my behavior? But how did I let it affect my behavior? Take a little more responsibility for the response. It didn't just happen to me. I let it happen. And then lastly, what would be a better way to respond next time I catch it? This is not the last time I'll be triggered in a similar way. And so it'd be helpful to think a little bit forward about next time something like this happens, what would be a more productive way to manage the reaction? How do I respond in a more deliberate way? And so that ability to catch it And then I encourage people to label it. Okay, there's my need to minimize, right? Minimize the level of risk, tension, discomfort in the situation. And I need to be careful because if I let that need to minimize get in the way, I'm going to become less and less candid. For other people, it's that need to win, to be right, to get your way, to sell your view to the group. And when that need to be right triggers, curiosity tends to be the first casualty. And so I need to label it. There's my need to minimize, or there's my need to win. I need to be careful here. Research shows that if you can label an emotional reaction, it gives you far more control over it. They call it naming and taming. And so the first 3 steps in the conversational capacity at the emotional level, the awareness level, is cultivating your ability to catch it, name it, and tame it under pressure. So you're spending less and less time out of the sweet spot because you're better at catching it when you're at risk of leaving it.
Yeah, and it's a sort of understanding that range, isn't it, between the two. Your diagram is quite nice because it just has the 2 ends and then the sweet spots in the middle, which is easy for everybody to understand. And it's just, everybody will have a different range. So it's understanding your specific range. And when you start to go out of the boundaries of that, the sweet spot won't be one, it'll have a radius around it probably. And there'll be the limits of that radius where you'll start to stretch into the boundary of whether you're getting hijacked and going for the win or going for the just being more passive and sitting back.
Right.
One of the things I used to use was a slight version of your model, which is also awareness, and then I would say responsibility. How are you going to respond to that awareness? And then I would talk about resources, which is more or less the skill thing. But the responsibility part then introduces this idea of mindset, because it's okay to notice it, right? It's another thing to actually then have this ability to process it cognitively and then recognize that there's something you could do about it if you're prepared to stretch the boundaries of your mindset. So maybe let's talk how we get from, okay, now we've caught this emotion, we've named it and tamed it. Okay, so now let's see how that's going to fit into, let's say, enhancing the mindset around conversations.
That's perfect. And that's a shift to the cognitive part of the discipline, right? So I've recognized my emotional reaction. I've caught it. I've named it. I've tamed it. That's one thing. The next thing I would do is pivot my attention onto what really matters in the conversation. So this ability to sort of stay focused on the purpose of the conversation. And so we refocus on what really matters. And so there's a conversational capacity mindset I help people learn to adopt, which is focused on learning. What needs to matter in a conversation where we're trying to exchange ideas and make a smart decision is learning, thinking more clearly, because it's hard to make a smart decision if you're not looking at the issue in a clear-headed way. And so thinking clearly, making smart choices are the primary goals, and learning is sort of the vehicle we use to get there. And if learning, thinking clearly, and making smart choices is the primary goal, then a couple of other things become really important to us in the conversational capacity mindset. We pool perspectives to expand and improve our thinking. We explore diverse points of view to help us think in a more rigorous way about the issue. We don't learn a lot by talking to people who see the world the same way we do, right? It's nice. If you want an ego massage, I highly recommend it. But if you want to learn, it's the worst possible thing you can do. So we want to lean into people with different functional backgrounds, different personalities, different life experiences, because they often help us see things about the problem we're trying to address that we wouldn't normally see. And so we don't just pool perspectives and kind of explore diverse perspectives. We do it with a deliberate bias.
Yeah.
We lean into difference, right? So we're seeking out people whose views contrast with our own, not because it'll make us comfortable, probably won't, and not because it'll make us feel like a genius, it probably won't, but because it actually makes us smarter.
Yeah. This word learning, that's just, if people can just kind of get their head around, it's a learning opportunity. And of course, this type of approach has been reinforced by the work of people like Carol Dweck, for example, around growth mindset. It's realizing that these are actually opportunities for us to learn something about ourselves and others, and to if we're prepared to go, okay, that didn't go as the way I like, rather than beating ourselves up, it's like, okay, what would happen if I adjusted something the next time, or what can I take from that I can enhance the same way a musician. I'm a musician, so the same way a musician will play a piece over and over again and won't get it right. But the thing is, if you're aware of where you made the errors, you can fix it. You can take that bit and work on it. You can change the way you sit, the way you approach a piece of music. So yeah, it's fantastic to hear you talk about then how you move to this idea of learning, and how that can become pivotal to get into the stage of actually developing the skills, because then learning really sets the scene for a willingness to embrace some new behaviors. So tell us how we get there from the mindset of learning to the ability to enhance and improve our conversational capacity.
Yeah, so someone with high conversational capacity is in the meeting and they're monitoring and managing their emotional reactions, and they're also monitoring and managing the reactions of others, right? So they're paying attention to what's going on within them and around them. So the awareness is key. They're able to refocus really quickly and stay focused on what matters in the conversation. Learning is more important than an ego massage. Which, just real quick, Jared, I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's something I tend to find amusing. Have you ever noticed that the price you often pay for getting smarter in a conversation is feeling dumber?
Yeah.
Right? Getting smarter often doesn't feel like getting smarter. You're like, oh man, I should have thought of that. What a moron. I just got smarter. My view of the world's improved, but it didn't feel that way. And so I talk about conversational capacity as a conversational martial art, where your enemy, or your opponent, I should say, not enemy, your opponent in the martial art is not the person, the issue, or the context. It's your ego. And if we want to stay focused on learning, we've got to learn to take our ego to the mat. And that's a great example. Getting smarter often requires a bit of an ego blow. And a lot of people would rather feel smart than get smart. And so I think in the conversational capacity mindset, we say, you know what? I don't care if my ego takes a short-term blow. I want to learn. I want to make smarter decisions. I want to think more clearly about the issue here. So, ego be damned. I'm going to focus on learning. And that's a little harder than it sounds. Sometimes you won't realize how much your ego is driving your day-to-day behavior until you try to set it aside and focus on something else.
Yeah, there is this concept of getting out of your own way, isn't there? And
right.
This is. But I guess if you go into these situations and conversations with a willingness to embrace the fact that maybe you're not right, and as you said, it's not always easy to not be right. However, if you're willing to go in saying, well, I will put across my point of view, and at the same time, what we want to come out with is not my point of view or somebody else's point of view, but maybe as a team we need to come out with the collective synergistic point of view that works for us. So talk a little bit about how that works, because I know that you have some nice tips for how to do that.
Yeah, and so that gets to the last domain, if you will, of practice. So I'm aware, I'm able to refocus quickly or stay focused on what matters. Learning is more important than an ego massage. The next step in the process is replace. And I replace what would have been my habitual behavioral reactions with the skills that'll hold me in the sweet spot. So when I need to minimize triggers and I'm at risk of watering down my point, covering up my perspective, or bringing it up in the hallway after the meeting, I catch it, name it, and tame it. I refocus on what matters, and then I use the candor skills. And there are 2 candor skills to stay in the sweet spot. Normally, candor is what gives way. The candor skills allow me to hold steady. For someone who's got a strong win tendency, they're in a meeting, there need to be right triggers. They can feel it welling up. Ooh, I want to get into it here. They catch the response, they refocus on what matters, learning, and they replace what would have been their habitual reaction, arguing, dismissing someone's view, rolling their eyes, making a snarky comment, with the curiosity behaviors. And it's these curiosity skills they use to replace their habitual reaction. And that is the basic drumbeat of practice. Catch it, name it, and tame it, refocus, and replace. So there's 2 candor skills and 2 curiosity skills.
So without revealing everything that's in the book, you've got lots of good examples in the book. Maybe give our listeners one example of how you can express the candor side of the equation in terms of your own, putting your own point of view into a conversation, and then perhaps how you deal with somebody who may not accept your point of view.
Yeah, well, the candor side of it, Steven Pinker, the eminent psychologist, said language is the magnificent faculty we use to get ideas out of one head and into another. And so I think the question becomes, if learning is the primary goal, how do we structure the candor in a more learning-focused way? How do we actually, structure our candor so that it helps facilitate an exchange of ideas? And so I talk about two basic skills. And one is state where you're at on the issue, your position on the issue at hand. In one sentence, no more than two. And so for our listeners who do any writing, it's like a topic sentence in good paragraph construction. You just let people know where you're at and where you're going. I think X. So if you're in a meeting and an acquisition is being discussed and you think it's a bad idea, your position might be, I think we should hold off on another acquisition for at least 6 more months. Boom, it's pretty clear where I'm at. And so state where you're at on the issue. But then the second skill is you need to show people how you got there, your cognitive roadmap. So you state where you're at on the issue, and then you share the thinking behind it. So I think we should hold off on another acquisition for 6 more months. Let me give a little background as to why I think that's the smartest move here. And I might share some, a financial spreadsheet, an economic forecast. I might share some previous experience I've had, but I really kind of lay out why do I hold the view I currently have. And I'm trying to help people see how I've reasoned to my current perspective. And so it's not just position ping pong. I think this, well, I think that. Let's do this. That won't work. Yes, it will. We're digging deeper into why do people hold the views they currently have. You kind of force people to take responsibility for their perspective by sharing the thinking behind it.
Yeah, and I found that personally absolutely brilliant because, as you say, the ping pong of I think and I think I don't agree with you, etc., is how a lot of people experience. And often, this comment that comes up every so often is somebody will say, when they've listened to it for a while, they say, you're both actually saying the same thing.
Right.
That's a classic. But you're saying it totally differently. It seems as though you're saying the same thing. So actually not just stating your point of view, but being able to explain your point of view, at least gives the other people a chance to better understand your reasoning and maybe not replay it back as you at the identity level being difficult or whatever, but actually that the way you're thinking about it may challenge them, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, as I point out, very often, the way I'm looking at an issue can teach you something about the issue. Oh, I never thought of it that way before. I was missing that piece of information, or I realize now I was making an erroneous assumption. And then the way you're looking at the issue can have the same effect on me. And so you can think about people who are able to work in the sweet spot as being good at collaborative critical thinking, where we're helping each other think more clearly about an issue. And you may help illuminate my blind spots. I may help illuminate yours. And there's no way I'm going to help you illuminate a blind spot if I don't share how I'm looking at the issue in a clear, lucid, accessible way. So state your view and then show you how you got there. And so those are the candor skills. It seems really basic, but like you said, it's amazing in a meeting how quickly when the pressure goes up, things evolve into position ping pong. And the team is skipping along the surface of the issue. I think this, well, I think this, let's do this, that won't work. We tried that before. And they're missing out on the juicy, interesting stuff. Why do people have different views to begin with?
Yeah, and then the counterexample of how you then encourage and manage your curiosity provides quite a nice tip for people, which, of course, once again, we're often missing. Just, as I say, it's not to reveal everything in the book, because I know that you have to read the book to get the finer points and the real skills. But there is a nice way in which you encourage people to be able to do this, enhance your curiosity skills.
Yeah. Yeah, the next skill is the big one. So I put my view on the table in a meeting and I've explained it. What's really unique about this discipline is the way we now treat, in a very explicit way, our current point of view. And we don't treat it like a truth. We carefully treat it like a hypothesis. You can define conversational capacity actually as the ability to hold your views hypothetically under pressure, where I'm just less attached to the view my brain's currently handing to me. And the way we treat it like a hypothesis is to test it. That's kind of the first curiosity skill as we move to that side of the sweet spot. You said earlier, consider that you might be wrong on issue. Yeah, just assume you're wrong. I think is an even better way to go. Your view on everything is only half-baked, right? There's very few things in life you know absolutely for sure, like maybe your phone number or your street address, but more complicated issues. If I asked you to describe in perfect detail the route from your home to your office, you couldn't even do it, right? You drive it every day, but you couldn't describe the route in perfect detail. You miss stuff constantly. And so how do I How do I know where my view is off? And so I say test it. And a good test signals an openness to disconfirming views and information. You're not just sitting there passively hoping that someone who sees a problem with your thinking or maybe a gap in your thinking will chime in and share it with you. You're inviting them to do it. If you're in a position of authority, you may need to encourage them and even reward people for doing it. And so a good test, again, signals an openness, and it can be a casual test, like what's your reaction to what I've just said? Or it can be far more rigorous. We're not moving to the next topic on the agenda until I get at least 3 concerns from the team about what I just suggested. Right? And so there's a whole bunch of examples in both books about how do you really hold your views hypothetically. I have a really juicy little practice in there for how to get better at doing that. And then a lot of examples of really rigorous, really smart ways of testing your thinking and letting people know you're not clinging to it rigidly like an absolute truth, but kind of a little suspect about your thinking, skeptical of it. You want to test it like a hypothesis.
In this final section, we get into what Craig cleverly calls cognitive cartography. And we finish with how to learn more about Craig's work. Yeah, it reminds me of this concept that, I have a map of the world or a model of the world, and you have a model of the world. And often when we disagree, the two models or maps bump into each other. And the real skill here is how do you take both maps and make a better map, basically.
That's it. That's exactly it.
So if you enter into the conversation with this viewpoint that our maps might collide, but actually saying when you're getting pushback, so my map is not working. This map is not taking us on the journey I thought it would. But actually the other guy's or other person's map doesn't seem to be getting us on the journey either. So how can we get the best of both maps and put them together? I'm simplifying a little bit, but it has this, how do we do that so we can all move forward together? Yeah?
I think that's a great way to frame. I don't think you're simplifying at all. That's actually a really clear picture of what's happening, right? I've got a mental map in my head, what M. Scott Peck on The Road Less Traveled referred to as the mental maps of reality we use to navigate the terrain of life. And the problem is, there's no way to really improve your mental map of reality without testing it, without bouncing it off reality, without bouncing it off the views of other people. So it's kind of like, cognitive cartography, right? How do we get better at building maps that make, more useful sense of the world around us so we're making smarter choices? And so I want to get my map out of my head and into the conversation in a clear way. Here's what I currently think makes the most sense and here's why. But then I'm also aware that my map's just that. It's a map. It's, the map is not the territory. And so how do I test it? And how do I invite people to help me improve my mental map of reality? So I think that's absolutely it.
Yeah. And coming to the end, a few of us in Europe have actually approached you about using some of our tools from the work of Dr. Dan Harrison to try and help people, let's say, get some awareness assessment and measurement of this using Dan's paradox thinking. And I think maybe we'll save that one for another day, but hopefully we'll get somewhere with that eventually. So getting down, we'll put a few links in the show notes for people who want to get access to your materials. I guess they can buy the books in all good bookstores. I think you've also got your own short course on this, and then it's available through the Blanchard organization. Isn't that right? In the organization for companies out there.
Yeah, I do workshops. I have a Conversational Capacity e-course on my website, conversationalcapacity.com, as well as a lot of articles and other resources available to people who are interested in learning more. And then my practice has been exploding, and so I partnered with the Ken Blanchard companies, as you mentioned, and we just launched in July the Conversational Capacity course that they're delivering globally, which has really, really worked out well. It's a lot of fun partnering with them. The course came out really, really nicely. And then, like you said, the Harrison assessment. I've worked with Rick Tate, who was one of your guests previously on the podcast, I understand. Rick and I are really good friends. We've known each other for years and worked actually on the engineering leadership program at the Boeing Leadership Center as faculty members for 15 years together. So we know each other really, really well. And so I've always been intrigued with the Harrison assessment and the paradoxes. And a few paradoxes really line up nicely with the ability to balance candor and curiosity under pressure. And so if you'd like to talk at a future time. It might be fun to get Rick and I on the show together to kind of have a conversation about that very issue, right? So how these things fit together and play together in the sandbox, so to speak.
I'll only do it if you'll both behave yourselves now.
Well, that's with Rick and I, that's very, very, very unlikely.
Yeah, there is the opinions paradox, for example, is a great example of how to take your certainty on one side and your open reflectiveness and find a balancing point between the two. But that's for another conversation.
Well said.
So
frankness and diplomacy, too.
Yes,
you could look at those
perfect.
two. Right?
Yeah, fantastic. And so I'd like to finish with what would be the couple of key tips you would give somebody now who wants to get into conversational capacities? Because you've spoken quite a bit about, some of the mechanisms within the research and the work you've done. But let's say somebody's sitting out there now thinking, okay, but actually these guys are onto something here. This guy Craig seems to have got onto something here. What would you say to people who want to get started even before they read your book? What would be some tips you could give them that could get them started?
Yeah, I think start looking for places in life. Reflect a little bit on your current situation. Where are there places, as you said, Jerry, earlier, where you're getting in your own way, where your ability to have the kind of influence you'd like to have, to affect change in the ways you'd like, to be as productive as you care to be in a situation, is limited perhaps by something you're struggling with. What's getting in the way of my ability to have as much influence as I'd like, let's say, in the organization? And start there. Where's some place I want to have more influence, make a bigger difference? I want to punch above my weight in terms of the impact I'm having on the community, on the organization, on the team. And then start saying, well, how do I, up my game? What are some things I could do? What's the investment I need to make in myself to become more influential? And it's usually a combination of those three things. I'm going to have to become more conscious and more self-aware. I'm going to have to learn to recognize and manage my emotional reactions. I'm also going to have to get better at focusing on what matters in the moment, right? Not getting distracted by my emotional reactions or the fog of difficult conversation, but staying really clearly focused on the goal. And then I need the skills to make that mindset more than just a bumper sticker. And so what is the work I need to do? For some of us, candor may be the bigger challenge, and those candor skills are the behaviors I need to get better at. For some of us, that need to be right, get to sell our view to others may be the dominant barrier to our effectiveness. And the curiosity skills, we talked about one, there's a second one. Those may need to be the muscles we need to strengthen. So start with, where are you getting in your own way? How would you like to be more effective? And then go from there.
Yeah, and actually life is a laboratory, and anybody who's a parent will maybe get plenty of opportunity to practice this. And in any situation, social situation, I would say to people, maybe the big ones that, on a scale of 1 to 10, the big ones are 9 and 10. Not always useful to start there. Start with the 2s and 3s and start to build your own confidence and belief in yourself that this stuff, you can learn it. And you won't always get it right, but as you keep practicing it, like practicing a musical instrument, practicing a sport, you get better at it. Then the bigger ones, when they come along, will seem less daunting. Would that be true?
Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to go to a half-day tennis clinic and immediately go out and look for the world's best tennis player and say, okay, let's go. You're not ready yet. Your skill level's not there. So I think, pick a conversation that'll stretch you a little bit, but not overwhelm you, and start there, right? So I think that's right. So, and an Influence in Action, my second book, it's a deeper dive into the whole discipline and a workbook. So a lot of practices, and that's one of them, right? Pick some appropriate level conversations to practice. And I also agree with you 100%. If this is a conversational martial art, the workplace is a great dojo, but life itself, right? It's nothing but one big dojo. You're always out there struggling sometimes to stay in that balanced state. And so whether it's personally or professionally, when you do trigger, bust out your trigger journal. What happened? Wow, I lost the plot there. What got in the way? Even when it goes sideways and you're not nearly as effective as you'd like, it's still an opportunity to learn. Get curious. Wow. Okay, it's a chance to ramp up your awareness a bit.
Yeah. And folks, if you want to enhance that starting point, go out and buy Craig's excellent books. As you say, if Influence in Action takes the first book to a whole different level in terms of the workbook aspect of it, loads of exercises in there. It's great. Craig Weber, thanks a million for sharing your insights and wisdom and for being my guest today.
Jerry, thank you for having me. I really had a good time. That went quickly.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. You will find details of what we covered in the show with links, etc. in the show notes. Please share your key takeaways from today's guest and let your friends and colleagues know about the podcast. Oh, and if there's a particular author or leading thinker you'd like me to interview, just get in touch and I'll do my best to get them on the show. This episode was brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's WIDECIRCLE.eu. Until next time.